So absolutely delighted to be chatting with you today. So thank you for that. And, first of all, I just want to tap into some of your experiences because you've had an incredible journey coaching. And I want to know just a little bit more about that in terms of how you fell into doing canoeing and what you did. I know we spoke about that before when we last chatted, but how did that come about? Because it's a really interesting journey, So if you could just tell people who are watching, where did you start? How did you fall in love with canoeing, and how did that journey take you to where you are now, where you're working with the British national team, and you've been to Olympics and so on, and working with some of the top athletes in the world?
Oh yeah, thanks, Gerard. It's nice to be on a predominantly football-oriented podcast. I think the former Craig would have, with his inflated ego of how good he was as a left back, would have been quite chuffed to be on a football podcast in the future, but sadly not as a player. Fell into coaching. That was a nice. I don't know if the pun was intended there, mate, but yeah, falling in was a good description of my canoeing career or my paddling career myself. Career is a strong word there. I got into paddling when I was 5. My brother, 5 years my senior, kind of got into it through an Army Open day when we used to go around the country in a caravan in the summer holidays. And I was one of the kicking and screaming kids of the pushy parents that wanted only to go to one venue on a weekend rather than split doing sports. So I was dragged along and thrown in the river quite literally at times. Yeah, and my own paddling kind of meandered through reasonably good at age group level, struggled in hindsight to really find any motivation or intentionality behind it. I've only made sense of that in my late 20s, early 30s. Subsequently, just kind of wondering what to do with life post-uni. A coach developer of the name Valon Edge sort of saw this meandering youth and dragged him in and asked if I'd be interested in having a look at doing some coaching courses and coaching voluntarily at the time when I was just 23. So started session coaching voluntary, and in terms of on paper, very linear from there, Gerard. Slowly fell in love with the concept of coaching and began to warm to canoeing. Kind of gone from very, very basic introductory level through junior pathways, under 23s into senior, and most recently had my debut experience of standing on a riverbank at the Olympic Games.
I love it. And your brother was obviously a part of this, right, in terms of that journey?
Yeah, a big part. He's a pretty successful paddler in himself, both in slalom, making the British senior team, but more predominantly in a discipline called freestyle, which is maybe like the BMX ramp equivalent of track cycling, perhaps. He was pretty proficient in that. But he was always my guide, my kind of role model for canoeing, really, and had a very artistic view of paddling in itself, a very pure, sort of efficient, Federer-esque, swan-like activity. My early experience of canoeing were just following him down a river, trying to stay safe, but also, tune into this kind of artistic model of performance.
Interesting. And then obviously, I know you said you've gone through a sort of linear way and probably, no pun intended, fell into a lot of opportunities, fell into the water, but it's actually quite good how it's grown organically. I'm really fascinated in when you were first going through that journey and you were working through the steps, how did you formulate what is now will be your coaching philosophy? How did you come up with some of those ideas? Was there any particular guide, or was it just as natural as it was where you try? Because obviously working in the sport that you do, it's incredibly different, certainly from my world in terms of football. Football is chaotic. It is a dynamical system. It's random, it's forever changing. But of course, there's a lot of dynamics with the water. So I'm even just trying to think about, in terms of practice design and how you're developing athletes, in your case, how you're developing individuals in your coaching philosophy. But straight away, the water changes. There's so many elements with the environment and your interactions that will influence how you work with people, how you design experiences. And that can really be difficult when you're preparing for tournaments. So how did you deal with those things and even like formulate your coaching? How did it all evolve to what it is now, and what would it be?
Yeah, fabulous question. and one I've only one I've come to realize over time. I think I would say for your football listeners, probably the water is their opponent, and it very much plays a role of either inviting or closing off opportunities for action in its dynamic nature. Where did I come to a philosophy? Begrudgingly over the years is the answer primarily. So I did a lot of what you call coach education, coach development courses in my youth as a coach. And it was definitely, I remember feeling quite uneasy with a big drive to find a philosophy, almost a push that it was like to tick off a module or something like that. You needed to have a coaching philosophy, and always felt quite disingenuous to me or non-authentic that I couldn't really just couldn't make sense of one really that I would attach to or would be an authentic picture of my practice. And subsequently, I used to pillage them off colleagues, or just come up with anything off the internet and whack it on a slide and hope to tick off a module. It's only in my latter days when a couple of good colleagues and friends started asking me questions that made sense to me, like, why do you coach the way you coach? And things like that. So I'm a little bit guarded around the word philosophy. Whilst I'm mindful, I'm very philosophical in myself these days, but I kind of think about principles these days than philosophy, because I'm aware it's always fluid and in motion and may well change over time. Yeah. So yes, I probably would say I had bit of a pedagogical awakening in 2017, 18 in that, and I mean that in a very sincere sense, in that I didn't have a clue how I was coaching or why I was coaching like that. I was just coaching on a philosophy that then believed that if I took care of relationships and I knew about technique in my sport, then this beautiful performance would naturally unfurl and everyone would have a great time and want to come back tomorrow. And of course, time and experience and the non-proportionality of human development probably wore me down over time. And I hit a wall really with it all, thanks to a few interventions from what have become good friends, and realized that the nature of our sport was very incongruent with the nature of how we were practicing. So we weren't practicing with fidelity towards the race itself. So my philosophy really has slowly meandered its way through a journey of discovery from that point, that I kind of principle around the end in mind now. And the end in mind as a principle for me is an infinite end, by the way. You never reach it, but it's just a reminder for me that the race run, the interaction between the paddler and the environment in the race run, is where we should be kind of, designing our practice around to prepare for, at whatever stage and ability your performance or the end is in mind for you. So that's really been a big kind of about term for my practice. I used to see practice as taking care of kind of jigsaw pieces, putting them together to make this beautiful picture on race day. And now I probably see it in reverse as understand the dynamic interaction in race day, and then look to scale that for practice over time. So the transfer is more rich, such things from an ecological language perspective as perception and action coupling is present in our training environment. It's representative of the race on a scaled level. And I guess, Gerard, the most important things for me were just the awakening is the word I use, because it was just becoming aware of what practice was, and did it align to any theory? Did it align to any motor learning theory? Did it even align to the sport? Well, largely no. It was a challenge because paddlers were doing pretty well at the time as well. But it certainly wasn't because I had any intentionality behind how we did practice. So yeah, largely, and of course I was doing things that I didn't know I was doing. I was practicing a constraints-led approach in some areas, but completely naive to the fact that I was doing it, and having an awareness over time as to the theory and applied research into practice and what that meant for me gave a sense of direction, a sense of purpose, clarity, and ability to co-design with athletes and confidence to practice in different ways, I guess.
And I think there was some coaches as well. I think you mentioned, Jimmy, before that maybe they coached in a certain way, but they didn't take on board that dynamicness or that adaptability within a race. Is that right? So was that an even influence for you in that journey? Some of the things you said there, where you might watch certain coaches teaching these athletes that, no, this is what we prepare, but they weren't preparing for things that could change. or something that we can predict? And was there any of those inspirational moments for you that then went, right, I'm going to do it this way?
Yeah, I'm always observant of others' practice with a really open mind, and I wouldn't be critical or pontificate or give advice, because I think I only try to interact in my own experience and what makes sense to me. What I noticed was a traditional approach to slalom, particularly, so we don't get a practice in our event, and the course is unique every time. The river, in fact, can be unique every time within reason. So we do what's called like a course walk on the bank, where we get to view the course, and athletes will traditionally plan their route with coaches. And then what you would traditionally hear around their sport in reflection on video review or in a hot debrief with athletes and coaches, like, how close to the plan were you? And I guess I was probably drawn into that for a time, into trying to sort of really stabilize, from a coaching perspective, the athlete's interaction with the event. And of course, you realize you have no control after a while. And you also, what always sat uncomfortably with me was that, well, how do we know the plan is correct for that individual in such a dynamic environment? How do we know that if people pontificate around 95% of the plan, if you hit that, you'll have done well? Well, what if the 5% is critical and the other 95% is largely uncritical? So just experiences over time with athletes, and predominantly, Gerard, athletes getting really frustrated, shouting at me because they felt roboticized in performance, and they were using an information from the coach, which I now would term an informational constraint or a verbal constraint, that was a non-specifying source of action for information for action for them in the event. So they effectively were self-analyzing what stroke they put in and whether it was the one the coach, as in me, would like it or not, rather than paying attention to the information in front of them that would invite action. And that was because I was prescribing a technical model of performance on them, or as I would call it, like a train-tracked route down the course.
Right.
So yeah, just athlete feedback. I mean, the beauty was, and I'm very thankful for it, that we had a rich enough relationship with a couple of athletes that they could push back and really challenge me as a coach to say, no, this isn't how I want to experience the environment.
I think that's interesting, because there's a couple of things that are popping into my mind straight away, and I'll try and ask you them all. One would be around the individual. So how does it look in your sport in terms of an individualized approach? How do you develop those athletes? And there are any examples that you could give where you try and develop them within the individual, within the collective, because obviously you've got a collective aspect, and obviously you want to win the tournament or whatever, which would be similar to us on a match day. We want to win the match, and we're training the team to do that. But then equally, there's a responsibility on the coach to think about that individual as a project within the collective, both long term and in general, in the short term, in relation to the next match or previous matches. So I'm just curious, I'm trying to learn from lessons from your sport, how that could potentially be adapted to football or rugby or any other sport. How did you do that? How did you individualize your approach? How did you develop individuals within your sport?
Yeah, I mean, it's an inherently individual sport, and I used to fall foul of this in that I used to think I created a good environment and had good relationships, but they weren't individualized, as I've learned now.
Right.
So communication, to be honest, asking and spending time getting to know people. I'm fortunate enough to work maximum 1 to 3 in my environment. So I'm not naive that is afforded to me quite easily. Yeah, I think going side by side on a journey as a coach. So we talk a lot about being companions on a learning journey of discovery, rather than having a hierarchical nature of coach or athletes. Of course, I might be positioned to have a good perspective on some areas relative to the athlete, but they're the one doing, and ultimately they'll have a much better perspective of the doing, which is the ultimate thing of what we're there to prepare for, than I would. Individualized, yeah. So we try to create a safe space, safe environment, safe space for communication, for dialogue, and for co-creation and co-design, I think, and very much centered around the athlete as a person. not just as an athlete. So person first, because I've found, that a real understanding of the individual nature of how their motivation and things like that, stuff I took for granted, like their individual motivation, their intentionality, the autonomy and relatedness from a self-determination perspective of how they go about their practice is critical. So we will position them, not position because it's not my power position to do that, but we'll invite opportunities for them to lead on their program, lead on practice design, coordinate and lead meetings with their support team.
Right.
And we all really have open lines of challenge and support. And then further to that, to touch on your point around how do we develop within performance and perform within development. In recent times, I've lent into an ecological approach to skills periodization from football, actually, from Fabian Otto, who works over at Mönchengladbach these days, formerly with Burnley, and his periodization of skills training. So it's something I've been working with Fabian on in the background, and we utilized into Tokyo about adopting for individual sport and across a micro and macro scale. So that's something we do, and the athletes will drive and lead on that as to where they position opportunities for development and performance and how they periodize skills over time. So where something that we'll be exploring skills-wise in November in our off-season, how that threads ultimately to April when they're preparing for national selection.
Right.
And they can see the threads, so the motivation, intentionality towards those practices are really embedded in their bigger picture, in their why, and then they can attach the individuality of their why to it at all times. I think that's something we do really well as a team, is we take time to understand an individual's why, their social, cultural, psychological kind of history and tendencies, and what that means for how they want to experience the world. So yes, we know they want to be world number one, an Olympic champion. How do they want to experience that journey as well? We take a lot of time to kind of understand that as what I call a transdisciplinary team.
I like that. Even just the last phrase there where you said about how do they want to experience that. And it goes back to the point you made before about co-design. This is something that I'm doing even in football, where I'll try and ask players just for their input. So how can we make this activity more challenging or less challenging? What are you coming to work on? What do you need help on today? How can I stretch you today? Trying to design experiences for the player that supports them relative to their individual development plan, their needs, their wants and their needs. So I love that co-design piece, because I think that's really important. Certainly when you're thinking about feedback. I mean, for me, a lot of the stuff that I'm doing with my own experiences and linked to my PhD, as you know, is that often feedback given isn't feedback received and understood. And I'm really interested in how coaches can be really sort of purposeful in how not only their observation, but how and when they give feedback, and using it so that it doesn't tell the player or the athlete what to do, where to look and how to move, but taps into the perception of that individual so they can come up with their own adaptable, movement signature, because every athlete has their own unique movement signature. And I'm just curious, in your sport and the work that you do every day, or even in the previously, what are some of the things that you do? Like, how do you deliver feedback now? What's your beliefs around use of feedback when you're giving players information, or even how and when maybe players give you, do they come to you for feedback? So rather than you always dictating how and what they receive, do they come to you and ask, like, with information? Are they giving you feedback? Are they setting you challenges? And I'm just curious, how does that look in your environment? And it's probably not an easy one to answer. And
I'm always getting feedback. I can tell you that, Gerard. Always getting feedback.
I can believe it.
Sometimes good. Yeah, so I think when we talk about individuality, like I was really kind of thinking of the word choice in practice, choice in how they want to experience feedback in practice, to help their growth and to get them to understand what adds value for them. Less is more is probably something I've come to learn. Yet you've got to be authentic, and you've got to meet people where they're at on that day. So, it's just, and how you go about understanding where they're at presenting to training is critical to that. So some days I might appear to be quite noisy, maybe in a slightly more guiding role. Other days I might appear to be really passive. We've chatted before, so
Yeah.
about where I position myself in coaching and how that's kind of like lacks tradition to some sports, and they would find that kind of disrespectful. And we'll touch on that in a minute. But I'm led with this choice, so it's common for me to sort of say, right, so we'll be clear, we'll have co-designed the intentionality of the practice. My job under a time constrained, high monetary value water session for us is that I will go and design the environment while the athletes are generally preparing for the session. What I'll do is I'll be preparing from a co-design perspective in that we've both established the intentionality of the practice. I will then design the taskscape, and I'll over design it in many ways, in that I'll basically be meticulously planned, because this is like a kind of a misunderstanding of the ecological approach in that we just let people do what they want to do. It's not true, not always. So I will be meticulously planned, and I'll set a taskscape that I think hits the intentions of the athlete in the sessions, and I'll also try and plan in the flexibility for it to flow wherever it may go. Obviously, I can't predict that by any means, and that I don't want to, and I'll always be surprised, but I'll try to allow it to have some scope to evolve naturally based on the athlete's take up with the environment. And then what I do is, so we'll often just paddle down the river, and I'll say, well, this is the landscape, and where would you like to work? So I'm not prescribing that there's 3 specific areas we're going to work at today. I'm like, here's 20. Do you want to pick 2? And then we'll see where we're at for time and see if we want to stick with that, or we'll rock into 3 or 4 later on. So they have choice from the off. And then I'll maybe say, well, we'll have established whether they want video or not. Where is it useful for me to video from? Because I can go for the easy one, like on the bridge where it's nice and warm and I don't have to listen to the roar of the river in my ear every 2 seconds. I can have a chat to my colleague, or quite often it makes them consider the perspective they would like to view their paddling from. So you'll see me really low down sometimes, right by the riverbank, sat down, which would offend the gymnastics coaches as far as I understand, looking probably quite passive. What I'm doing there is trying to, first of all, I'm taking the invitation from them to understand it from their viewpoint. They want me to get as close to their first person perspective of where their attention is in the environment. And it's fascinating, because we see a very different world from above than we do at water level. And you can be quite patronizing as a coach to see things, like to assume that they see what you see, because we have like a 3 meter, different view, which is bird's eye. So little things like that. So I'll often be seen, asking for permission of what they would like from coaching, where they would like me, what they would like from feedback, where will feedback add value, what won't they like as well, what's not going to add value, what doesn't work, because that's important to hear. So I'm trying to understand the permissions of my role in adding value to practice, not assuming that I can add value because of this knowledge base and experience that I have.
I love that. I mean, even just thinking there, I'm curious, have you done that in games, whether it's at Tokyo or whether it's wherever? Have you been sat in different positions, coaching positions, that are unnatural to maybe, or not traditional to how others have typically stood, or where they would stand?
I would, possibly, yeah. I mean, I've moved around a lot. That's what I'd say. I mean, you observe others, but if we don't understand the intention behind why they're sat there, they might just be having a relax. And in Tokyo terms, getting the feet wet because it was absolutely baking. I
mean, where this position?
It's intentional for sure. In terms of, we established into that what each phase of training looked like through the post model that I touched on earlier.
Yeah.
And what that meant for coaching and what that meant for me. And that would have included, am I videoing or not? What's the purpose of that? Where am I adding value of standing, sitting? Am I even not in the session? That's important as well. Like, is there coaching present, or are you self-discovery? Lots of little things like that have become important for me over time, I think.
Where is the best one for you? I don't know if there's a right and wrong answer here. There probably isn't. But I'm just curious, where, and you've already alluded to it, where it depends, and it's what you're doing. You've said that already. I'm just curious, what makes it a good coaching position? Because I'm trying to even think about now relating that to football. You know, so if coaches are working with defenders, they might stand behind defensive unit, but then there might be some that would argue that's not the best position, being stood next to the keeper or behind. They would actually want to see what the forwards are seeing, so they would stand behind the attack. Others, for me, it would more be, I'd be more interested in like, what's the best position for you that you can understand what's happening and go and affect it potentially. But I'm curious to know what you think. Like, what influences, other than some of the things you've mentioned already, where the best coaching position is to be, whether that's in a tournament or in training?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of dynamic factors in that. My instinct says a variety of, and some of the influencing factors would be the intention of the session or the race, the individual athlete's permission on that. So I've got in my head here, there's a couple of things. So there's a position that I feel I might understand my bias or my curiosities about the practice from, that might not necessarily align to where the athlete wants me to add value for them in the session, if that makes sense. So there's a few things in my mind often in practice. It's like, am I trying to understand the field of information that they're paying attention to try and stabilize action on around a task or to try and adapt to? And then there's also like, are there other perspectives that are useful that they don't have available that can perhaps guide attention into a broader field of information to act upon? And then other stuff like just natural constraints of the environment. So we go to Tokyo and the organizers go, you cannot go on the right bank. Or as it were, in the first 2 days, we were in a British only isolation because we were rampant with COVID at the time. You coach from the right bank, the rest of the world coaches from the left. So it's constraints effectively in terms of logistics, organization, stuff out of your control. But when it's within your control, I think it's that balance of dialogue with the athlete, with the players, with the team, of where's going to add value, and a variety. I think if you only see it through one lens, it's easy to create bias, and it to not be as dynamic as it's actually experienced. So I would be looking for a variety in general, but always looking to be paddler led on that.
I love it. And I think it's even interesting just listening to you talk. I'm curious how much is the feedback and because you're very critical, but you know, I'm getting the impression as well, and I'm the same, where everything we do is underpinned by evidence. So it's not just, there will be some of our opinion, our beliefs in that for sure, but you know, you've talked about ecological dynamics, you've talked about different frameworks, a constraints-led approach. So there's a theoretical underpinning, if you like, or theoretical framework that will also influence your coaching. And obviously you've gone on that academic journey as well. I'm just curious at how important or how beneficial have you found that, you know, for you at the level that you've worked at, and even for coaches who are listening?
Very over time, I would say. I don't have any regrets though, in the respect that I think those jolts in my career came at the right time, and they came because I'd experienced things like what I call excellent mistakes. Right. The paddlers I was working with over the years, I apologize for calling them excellent mistakes. I probably wasn't coaching very well from their pathway. But in terms of experiencing your own journey and I guess learning from your own, you know, successes and challenges was really critical for me. Finding research around motor learning and stuff, and you know, how we learn the way we learn, and all aspects within that. Like, I'm fascinated around perception. It was really a really critical sort of research area for our sport for me, and that's led me into various different rabbit holes over the years. I think what it did was just, it was an awakening. It was an awareness of how I was currently practicing that I hadn't considered. Like, I hadn't considered what the sport was, and that might be a useful, I mean, football's an extremely established sport, don't get me wrong, with a lot of opinions on how it should be played. But one of the most critical chapters in my career was actually just asking, what is canoe slalom in terms of the race run interaction itself? What does it demand of the person in the interaction on the race run? Not as a sum of the parts of being great physically, great mentally. What are the actual dynamic interactions at play there? What does that mean for practice? And that led me really to go, oh God, I don't know what coaching is. It just completely turned my world upside down. So, but I was motivated to do that. And I kind of found a former academic self within myself that managed to just about get me kicking and screaming through what is quite heavy literature.
Yeah.
So I think part of that is then surrounding yourself with really good companions who can simplify some of that stuff, of which yourself will be one and many, many others. But it has been critical for me understanding why we practice the way we practice. And I'm kind of got a selfless motivation. I hope it's selfless now, that pedagogy or methodology of coaching appears to be the domain of coaches to me, or coach developers. And I would love us to get to a world where players, where paddlers, athletes, participants could actually answer the question of why we practice the way we practice with some level of informed, theory behind it, at a very simple level, or a level, should I say, that was suitable for them. But actually, the ability for the individual doing the doing, because the sport is theirs, to be able to articulate why they do their practice the way they do their practice would, I think, be a really exciting place for us to get to in sport.
No, I completely agree. I think the coach that's coming through now, and this emerging coach evolving, they're definitely more critical, aren't they? Critical thinking, looking for evidence, but more curious as well. And it's mad because I'm probably the same as you, that the more I've sort of studied, I've asked questions, and then you said about rabbit holes. I'll often think like, God, I don't know the answers. I don't know. And then you'll get more answers, and you start to really realize how much you don't know, which is really cool, actually, in some respects. Pretty scary in others. But we've just got to be curious, haven't we? And I mean, I've got 2 or 3 more questions for you. One of them is just going back a few steps around your work at a high performing environment, and being in Tokyo and being in some of the other, Olympic Games and other competitions that you've been in. What's required of a coach to get to that level? For you, and what took you to that level? What did you need to have to be able to operate effectively at the highest level in that elite performance with some of the best athletes in your sport?
Yeah, I think you need to be working with the best athletes in the sport, and I was lucky enough to be working with a few of them that had nothing to do with my skill as a coach. So maybe there's a bit of placement and a bit of luck in there, Gerard, for sure, along the way. Like, I had a very unique career in that I've managed my development has been in parallel with a couple of athletes' development through their their career. Excuse me. In terms of what you need at that level, I think you can't replace relationships. Like, of all the talk we've had on the chat today, around theoretical frameworks, approaches to coaching, I think you can't replace that we're dealing in a human to human interaction, and then a human to environment interaction across us all, unless we are skilled craftspeople in the relationship, in the art of relationships, in the art of understanding others and communicating with others. I think we've got nothing else. You can be the best coach in the world. You can have the most technical knowledge of canoe slalom you want. If you can't connect with people who are doing the doing, then you're going to be probably wasted on the front line on the riverbank. So there's that aspect. I think the modern coach in slalom, you have to know your sport, undoubtedly. As I found motor learning, I was glad I found it after I had a real rich understanding of the sport, because the frameworks, the practices that then led me to consider, I could conceptualize into the sport. I wasn't trying to do it the other way around. Like, I would probably find it really hard to come and coach with constraints in football, because my knowledge of football is basically, watching Aston Villa on the TV, and that's probably not a great level of football, or from the Holt end in a former life. So there's that aspect as well. And in the modern sport, for us, you've got to be able to work within a team.
Yeah.
Gone are the days, even within the smaller sports of canoe slalom, that you can operate one-to-one on the bank now. It's a big operation, and you've got to be able to. One of the key roles of the coach is to coordinate a support team around an athlete, And I say coordinate, I don't say lead, because for me, that is the role of the athlete to lead. I take away some of the logistics by coordinating some of those entanglements between the practitioners to simplify things for the athlete in terms of information. Yet you've got to be dynamic in being able to work alone one-to-one, but also say 1 to 10, 1 to 15 at times, and get people moving with the same sense of direction, with the person in mind. Further to that, I think it's all very individual, really. Like, I think the richness of teams is that I don't think there is a prescribed model of coaching, which is fantastic. There's one I've found and that continues to evolve. But the premises really, for me, rely on relationships, sport-specific understanding at a doing level as well as a conceptual level, or knowledge of or knowledge about, as we would know from Gibson. But the dynamics of the person-to-person interaction can't be replaced and should be up front and center at all times.
I love that. I mean, yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think how you bring people with you, isn't it, is so key. So you can have all the coaching stuff, but again, that unconditional sort of support and attention is super, super important. Connecting with people, knowing that you care, yeah, it's huge. How you bring them
It is, and I'd even go as far as saying, or how you evolve together so they can bring you with them.
Oh yeah, I like that.
That's really rich and important, because in my companion sort of conceptualization of athlete and coach, you're walking out together into the world. So I think that's really important. There'll be times when one is leading the other, but essentially you're guiding each other through what is a very complex environment, and as you've touched on, one which is very uncertain.
That's brilliant. And just finally, if you were to go into football, let's say, or any sport, which is different. So we're looking at invasion sports, right? But I guess it could be anything. It could be gymnastics or whatever. What would you try and do that you would take from your work in, slalom canoeing and that sort of uncertainty and the experiences you've had of working at that Olympic level? What would be transferable for you that you could apply into other sports like football, rugby, basketball, or even a non-invasion sport?
Yeah, I think about this a lot because I've got a couple of good friends and colleagues who work in gymnastics. Obviously, they're scored on aesthetics for set routines as well as, and we're just like time and penalties. So really interesting in that we're both quite artistically complex sports, but one is kind of analyzed for it and scored for it, and another isn't. I mean, my first premise is to understand the sport, like really critically ask myself, what is that sport? And go and find that out and immerse myself in it, like dwell in it and connect with others who are more experienced in it to understand what it is. Because as I've touched on there, whilst there might on the surface appear similarities between some sports, just the rules or the constraints around particular areas of the sport mean that different practices apply. So, self-organization and functional variability practice in canoe slalom may look very different to a sport that is measured on aesthetics, such as gymnastics. I think the principles apply, but it'll look very different in practice, perhaps, around the scaling of that sort of approach. And then the relationships as well comes forward again for me. So understanding the sport, taking time to understand the relationships with people in the sport, because ultimately they're the experts, they're the ones doing the doing. And in terms of some practices, I think particularly, as you know, in team sports, my understanding of where skill emerges from comes through Newell's constraints, model of constraints, and it's been a rich part of removing a lot of the ego in coaching, or removing instances of behavior that I used to go, oh, that's an attitude problem. I would egotistically judge that, to actually trying to understand where the interaction of those constraints has caused or led for that, led for that behavior to emerge. So, it might be that they've had a really rough time in school before coming to practice, etc. And therefore it's not a laziness problem. They're guarding against some challenges and an inability to communicate that to the coach. And therefore me trying to understand behavior in context would be critical, rather than judge it from a position of hierarchy. Yeah, they're my key answers. And it is fascinating. And as you know, I'm getting more and more interested in coach development. So going cross-sport is probably a reality, hopefully, in the future.
Yeah.
And starting to branch out into other domains at the moment, which will challenge me in this space, which is kind of where my passion is leading over time.
Well, I think what you've said even there is so important for coaches, because I think about my sport now, football. The object of the game is to score more goals than the opposition, and the principles are very similar to, obviously we're confined by the offside rule that defines the game, so that makes it different to American football, makes it different to rugby, to basketball. Basketball has similar, similarities to football in terms of the transitions, but basketball is probably a lot more transitional. And obviously there's other rules with timeouts and other things in other sports, and like hockey, where there's constraints on the rules where certain players can go in certain areas and they're restricted. And whereas in football, it's fluid, you can wherever. But then, of course, the keeper can't handball the ball outside the penalty area. But that, so there's certain variables. But I think it was interesting now, forgetting all that, just going back to the simple, brilliant basics of what is the sport. So what is the principles of the sport? Know the sport really well. What makes playing football football? And then how do we get better at that? And again, you've talked about relationships is key, but equally like manipulating, whether it's constraints, conditions, whatever language people want to use, but really thinking about, is this going to, you mentioned something before around help or hinder. So is what we're going to do help or hinder? And just picking your moments, but then involving players within that design. And they're probably been key messages you said throughout. I'm quite fascinated on, there was one where you talked about like this artistic bit. And I think that's something to explore, because with football, for example, and I guess it's the same in the other invasion sports, it's a point on who scores the most points wins. But equally, there's that, we are in the entertainment business, and fans or boards of directors will be unhappy if there's certain, or even like coaches themselves, if they're winning, but it wasn't attractive football, or whatever that looks like, or it wasn't really intelligent play, wasn't creative. Are people going to want to pay to watch that? I went recently in Portugal, speaking at all the conferences, as you know, and I was catching with a couple of mates of mine, and I managed to catch, obviously the first teams play, Sporting and Benfica. They played on different days in the cup, but on one of the days I actually saw the youth academies play. And it just so happened in this particular game, Sporting and Benfica were playing against each other. So it's obviously there's a rival derby, which academy is better. There's all that going on. I would have paid to watch that game. I remember sitting to the guy next to me and I said, would you have paid for that? Yeah, I would have as well, because it was so entertaining. Kids were creative. There was goals end to end. There was moments where Benfica were on top and dominating. And then somehow, like, there was an unbelievable free kick from one of the Sporting players, which was just outrageous. Then there was a bit of individual quality when they were receiving on a high press. And the Sporting players got the boys, literally got no options. And he somehow, some way, dribbled his way and twisted and turning out of trouble. And he did something I've not seen before. And it was like, I was like, and then they're combining. And I just thought there's probably an element of that as well, that artistic individuality. We don't get scored on that, but we probably do, like, unofficially. You could win the game 1-0, but there's certainly an entertainment value. And how do you develop creative thinkers? How do you develop adaptable movers, people who are going to come up with solutions that we've not seen before? And the only way of doing that is a lot of the stuff that you said before. If we just coach in the way we've been coached, or the way we think is the traditional way to do it, we're just going to create the same rigid, traditional box size solutions to patterns, aren't we? Whereas what you alluded to earlier, and even in that last sentence, if we're talking about like ecological dynamics, perception, action, coupling, Gibson's work, Newell's work, just in general, just in plain English, creating environments that are going to give players choice. Use that word earlier, choice and consequence and problems to solve. They're then going to have to come with their own solution, aren't they? And we're going on that journey with them. I think that's incredible what you talked about there. And yeah, I think that'd be really exciting.
Yeah, I'll give you a little story on the back of that you reminded me of. So thank you. So I kicked back quite hard amongst their coaching team, and it was kind of a self-realizing conversation as evolved for me. We talk a lot about consistency in our sport, like we need to be more consistent. And I challenged that word consistency and our understanding of it, and shifted towards using the word stability a little bit more, because I think what athletes and coaches were inferring was different to the language in a way. So athletes and coaches were getting drawn into wanting to be consistent. So if you did something once, you technically broke that down into how it was done, and then you wanted to be consistent with the application of that technical model, and that would mean stable practice. You put that section together into 8 sections, you suddenly have a full competition run. Lovely, lovely. Off we go, top of the podium. I actually think what we understand and what we need to be better with language is that we're looking for a stable outcome. And something I consider a lot, and it's maybe a question for coaches in football and all sports to reflect upon, which was really useful for me, was how much do your practices invite or inhibit creativity? So, I hear a lot about, and I'm not close enough to pretend to speak with intelligence here, but I hear a lot about game models. And I wonder how adaptable. I mean, this is an offline conversation. I'm really curious as to what is on those clipboards and iPads when they're bringing a sub on as well. I'd love to know that. That fascinates me, but that's a different conversation. Yeah, how much does your practice invite or inhibit creativity? So I have an adaptability folder on this desktop behind me, and that is really for me a reminder for me to celebrate creative solutions. So I have shifted in my coaching to really affirming creative, adaptable solutions, affirming the bravery, the attention that was required to see that opportunity and to commit to it, things like this. It may not be the fastest way, but what I'm doing in affirming that is I'm encouraging a variety of different movement solutions to a task outcome. And that's how we create stability, because a lot of the challenges I've previously had in coaching when we're trying to hit a plan, i.e. a technical model, is that people start to evaluate against that in this dynamic world that we have little control over, i.e. I cannot control being on this blade or that foot to shoot that ball from 18 yards every time, given where the opponent is. And I'm evaluating that I'm not where I want to be and striking at the angle I want to be, on the foot I want to be.
Right.
And in the meantime, I'm doing that, the defender's probably gone straight through me, or the opportunity for action is gone, and I've missed the opportunity to, maybe look up and spray a pass right, or sidestep and create more space on the other foot. So I'm looking to invite an environment of creativity and affirm that in its richness, so that, the athletes start to trust themselves in the environment to be creative. Because you're right, we all love to watch creative individuals play and flair players, and we all those wow moments, and that's what sport's all about, isn't it? And the level of people that I'm fortunate to work with, they want to be pioneers in the sport.
Right.
They're probably looking to get techniques or skills labeled after them with their names attached over time, as is the history of Canoe Slalom over the years. So I think that's really rich. Like, how in a search for consistency, be careful. Is that what you actually mean? Or do you want adaptable stability, i.e. stable outcomes, but adapting to a very dynamic nature of practice or performance? And therefore, is your practice enabling creativity, or is it inhibiting it?
I love that. That's a great one to finish on, to be fair, because I think that's incredible. I think creativity obviously comes in different shapes and sizes. And a lot of people, I think, in football talk about creativity from the offensive players and the more attacking players, but you can equally be creative in your defending, but yeah, I love that. I absolutely love that. That's one to finish on for sure, because that'll be a great one in terms of anyone listening. How do your practices encourage creativity or not, as the case may be? So yeah, no, I love it. Unbelievable chat. And we'll end up probably doing more of these offline and even recorded as well. But thank you so much for your time. And it's been great just to tap into some of your experiences, obviously blending research with the practice and everything you do. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Gerard. Thanks for having me on.
Top man.